The third foundation for us to lay to truly get the most out of understanding this fatherhood of God is to understand what is meant by the spirit of sonship. The first foundation is salvation, because salvation gives us access to this relationship through forgiveness and being made right with God. We can become children of God. And the second foundation that we've talked through is that of adoption, that God goes further than just forgiving us. He invites us into a family relationship where we become co-heirs with Christ and receive an amazing inheritance. But there's more to it than just those two things, and this is where the Bible would talk about the spirit of sonship. And this is the area that the fatherhood of God would probably most relate to us, because it speaks of our access to an intimate relationship with God. In John 14, we see that Jesus says that if we've seen Jesus, then we've seen the Father. And Jesus introduces us to this idea of the fatherhood of God and gives us a new identity and a new sense of the nature of God in a whole new way from what people had experienced prior to Jesus coming. And in Romans chapter 8, we see this fatherhood of God developed in more depth, where this intimacy of relationship can be further understood as we explore this idea of the spirit of sonship. Literally, in the original translation, it's talking about the spirit of adoption. And when we talk about the spirit of sonship, please understand that as gender neutral. We're talking about sons and daughters of God. But this spirit of sonship is something that once we grasp, it unlocks for us how to have an intimate relationship with God. In Romans 8 and verse 14, we see that those who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. Remember when we were looking back and we talked about the sons of disobedience being subject to the wrath of God, that when we stood outside the family of God, we were separated. But when we choose to live in relationship, we become children of God or sons of God. And consequently, we get this new identity. And because of that new identity, we see in verse 15 that we're no longer slaves to fear. Because we've received the spirit of sonship, we can now have a relationship with God that is no longer based on fear. And when many of us have had a relationship with our natural fathers that may not have been the most healthy, sometimes it's important to understand that when we come into a relationship with God, we are no longer slaves to fear. What that means is that we've been set free. We need to discover more of that freedom that comes through the relationship with God. When we've had an unhealthy human relationship, it can create in us unhealthy thinking patterns. And those unhealthy thinking patterns, when those occur for us often in our childhood, they can lead to core beliefs where we create a suit of armour for ourselves to keep ourselves safe. But as my wife would say, when we move into adulthood, the rules that we've created in the small world of our childhood don't quite work in the same way. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Imagine three small children growing up in a family where dad is alcoholic. And when dad comes home from the pub at night, he's quite often violent, he might beat mum, and it's a scary situation. And these three children respond in three different ways. The eldest one is old enough to sort of stand up to dad and say, "You hit me, then I'll have you." And that's a sense of aggression and a sense of standing up. Whereas the second son's not big enough to stand up to dad, but can't escape. So he will instead go and say, "Hey dad, let me get your pipe for you, let me get the slippers for you." In other words, if I appease you, then you won't hit me, you won't hurt me. Whereas the third son is so small, all he can do is run away and escape and hide, and he goes and hides in the wardrobe. As those three children grow up and move into the adult world, imagine that they're at work, and the boss, who they don't quite know that well or they don't get on with, invites them into the office one by one. The first son says, "Well, I'm going to get sacked, so I know what I'll do is I'll stand up and I won't give him a satisfaction." So he walks into the office and says, "I won't let you mistreat me and quit, and I'm going to quit before you do that." In other words, he carries those same rules into adulthood. The middle son, in carrying his rules through, he'll go in and say, "Oh boss, don't sack me. I tell you what, I'll work longer hours, I'll do more, I'll take a pay cut. In other words, those rules of appeasement come into how he responds. Whereas the third son, with his rules, would just go, I can't cope with this, I'll quit and I'll run away and I won't go into the office. When all along the boss wanted to meet with them to say, I'm really pleased with your work, I want to give you a promotion. But because of the rules they've created, they don't enjoy the fullness of what's there for them. And for many of us, we live with a spirit of fear because of what we've experienced. And the spirit of sonship points us to no longer being slaves and being able to live in the freedom of what God has done for us.